Thank you
Oh,
everyone so much for joining us tonight. So tonight we're joined by Dr. Lisa Anderson and Dr. Joanne Freeman.
it is my great pleasure to introduce Joanne Freeman tonight. So Professor Freeman is a professor of history and American studies at Yale. She's written two books that you should read immediately. One is Affairs of Honor, National Politics in the New Republic, and the other is The Field of Blood, which is the best title ever, Violence in Congress and the Road to Civil War. She's also edited 2 volumes of Alexander Hamilton's writing, so she spent a lot of time with Alexander Hamilton. Professor Freeman is a very public-minded historian in addition to being an accomplished academic. And many of our audience members tonight probably know her as the host of History Matters, which is sponsored by the National Council for History Education. So please join me in welcoming Professor Freeman.
Such a pleasure to be here. Even and particularly with something as zesty as the Reynolds pamphlet.
It is kind of fun, right? Well, so we found the Reynolds pamphlet in the vault. We knew it was there. I will say that for years, Sandy has actually taken some pleasure in kind of surprising people with it, that she didn't tell it what it was, and then she'd show it to them. Collections people have a very interesting sense of humor that I thoroughly appreciate.
Well, and it looks so sedate.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
I think it's typeface, maybe?
Well, and the title, observations on certain documents. I mean,
Well, maybe we should start. Can you illuminate that just a little bit for us? Like, okay, observations on certain what are the certain documents? What's going on here? What is this thing about? How do you encapsulate it in just a small kind of introduction?
Well, first I'll say that this is a really typical 18th century political pamphlet title they're huge like this. We're going to see another pamphlet soon that will have a very similar title. In this case, what Hamilton is actually saying is, I'm making an observation on something that someone already said about me, and they accused me, you could see here, of a charge of speculation, but I have something else to say. And you can see further down, he says, fully refuted. So he's kind of laying it out here, right? Observations of certain documents, things said in someone else's pamphlet, and it makes it sound like I engaged in speculation, but I have fully refuted myself. All on the title page.
I mean, why even bother opening it, right? I'll tell you why. Okay, so I think in order to understand the pamphlet, we need to start by understanding a little bit about Hamilton, right? So
Indeed.
What can you tell us about Hamilton that will help us understand this?
Okay, so Hamilton at the time, and what we're going to be talking about when we talk about the Reynolds pamphlet is the Reynolds Affair, and then the Reynolds pamphlet. And the Reynolds Affair happens when Hamilton is Secretary of the Treasury. And in a sense, that's where our story begins. Before this point, actually, the Hamilton musical makes it very easy to talk about Hamilton somewhat because so much of his life is contained in it. But he had fought in the Revolution. He'd been an aide to George Washington. He went on, obviously, to be engaged in the Constitutional Convention, joined with Madison and John Jay to do the Federalist essays. And then in 1789, he rises to be Secretary of the Treasury, picked for that position by George Washington. Now, the important thing to know about Hamilton at the outset here is that as Secretary of the Treasury, he was by far like the most controversial member of Washington's cabinet, and you could even say the most controversial politician in the nation's capital. He had very strong ideas about everything, but he had very strong ideas about what he wanted the new government to be like. And he wanted it to be really strong, and he wanted it to be really centralized. And when he became Secretary of the Treasury, he kept pushing through policies and bills and creating or trying to create institutions that would do that, strengthen the national government, which was a big deal because a lot of people weren't really excited about a strong national government. The nation had essentially just broken away from a monarchy. So, hey, let's have another strong central government was not a uniform opinion. And Hamilton was never shy about anything. So he just hammered away and did what he wanted. And he attracted a lot of attention. His policies attracted a lot of attention. And he was always a figure of controversy.
So it's interesting because right from the beginning, you're using these expressions like he's pushing, he's controversial, all this kind of stuff. Can you talk a little bit about what politics as a whole is generally like at this time?
Right.
And maybe we happen to have another slide that might illuminate some of the points you're going to make.
There you go. This wonderful, wonderful cartoon from the period. This is a cartoon. So my overall point here, so Hamilton is pushing and aggressive and, not shy in asserting his policies. But the thing to know about the period, and I just love this cartoon because it says it in one image, is that the 1790s generally and the second half of the 1790s particularly were a really intense, chaotic, sort of somewhat crazy period with a lot of dirty, nasty politics involved, because if you think about it, it's the first decade that this new government is getting underway. It's the only republic of its kind in a world where pretty much it's monarchies. And so it's experimental, and no one at the time, of course, knows if it's going to survive. And we have the advantage of hindsight, so we look back to the founding, all in capital letters, and say, oh, well, it's the founding, meaning that, of course, it kept going. But if you look ahead in time with the people in this time period, they weren't sure about anything. And so politics is really intense because everybody thinks, if my opponent does something supremely stupid or bad, or if I do, the whole thing's going to collapse. So what you see here is a fight that broke out in Congress in 1798 between a Federalist, which is Hamilton's team, his party, so to speak, and a Republican. And it breaks out, it's in the midst of debate over a maybe war with France. So the nation is already, kind of uptight with what's happening with France and everything else that I just talked about, plus the French Revolution. What does that mean? It's a lot of reason for angst. So here you see, and it's such a wonderful cartoon. There's the guy on the right is Roger Griswold of Connecticut, and he began to cane Matthew Lyon, who apparently grabbed fireplace tongs to fight back. And they had this real fight over Griswold saying something insulting to Lyon, and Lyon wanted to fight back over it. It's partisan, and people who knew about it afterwards were like, yeah, hit him again. So it shows the politics. What I love about this image, and I have to comment on it only because it's not true as good as it is, the cartoon shows the rest of Congress being like, like, this is great. What a great thing. And the fact of the matter is, I don't think they were all laughing. Many years ago, I found a letter of a member of Congress at this time to his wife. And he's writing the letter, the normal letter to his wife. And then you can tell he stops. And then he starts writing again. And he essentially says, you won't believe what just happened. He says, here I am writing. And then I heard the sound of something hitting cloth. And I looked up. And this is what he sees. So he's like literally caught in the moment, like, la, 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 I'm doing my normal Congress. What? So that's not a shocking, outstanding moment in a way. It's representative of the intense spirit of politics in this time.
That's a lot. Okay, so I think, no, I was just taking in like the volatility of Congress at this moment, it's always like very abrupt because it seems so counter to how we remember or memorialize, right? The actual history is much richer.
Right? We don't think of the founding period this way.
No.
We like to make golden moments in the past. Yeah. There aren't any golden moments in the past, but the founding is way more interesting and has a lot more to say when we get past the pedestal view. This is definitely not pedestal founding.
Well, and I know we have a couple slides with quotations from Hamilton, right? Where he is describing the nature of politics in this era and its rowdiness, right?
Precisely. So politics generally is rowdy, and Hamilton attracts a lot of attacks because he's so controversial and so assertive and really driving policy when he's Secretary of the Treasury. So he is not shy about stepping forward, and he does it many times, and essentially saying, they're all out to get me. They're all out to get me. in one letter, he says that he thinks there are, this is actually a quote, malicious intrigues to stab me in the dark, right? They're out to get me. And here's just a description, and this is a prettier description than malicious intrigues to stab me in the dark. This actually is pulled from the Reynolds pamphlet, in which he's explaining what's happening at the moment, and that he is a target, he's a victim of what's going on at the time. He says, and if truly this be, as every appearance indicates, a conspiracy of vice against virtue, ought I not rather to be flattered that I have been so long and so peculiarly an object of persecution? Ought I to regret if there be anything about me so formidable to the faction, meaning the Republicans, as to have made me worthy to be distinguished by the plenitude of its rancor and venom?
Poetic.
We need the next slide. In the gratification of this baleful spirit, we not only hear the Jacobin newspapers continually ring with odious insinuations and charges against many of our most virtuous citizens, but periodical pamphlets issue from the same presses, full freighted with misrepresentation and falsehood, fake news, artfully calculated to hold up the opponents of the faction, meaning the Federalists, to the jealousy and distrust of the present generation, and if possible, to transmit their names with dishonor to posterity. Even the great and multiplied services, the tried and rarely equaled virtues of a Washington, can secure no exemption. So this is a long, fancy, because it's in a pamphlet way, of saying it's unbelievable what the Republicans are doing. And I should be honored, I guess, that they're coming after me all the time, but it's rather remarkable that they're screaming about us in such a horrible and insulting way all the time.
Well, and you've alluded a couple times to the fact that there were lots of people who didn't like Hamilton. And it wasn't just the rabble, I think is really interesting. So if we go to the next slide, I think you selected a great example of this.
Oh, yeah. No, there were a lot of people who didn't like Hamilton. A lot of people with power didn't like Hamilton. And I suppose it's no surprise that John Adams really, as a matter of fact, both John and Abigail were really not big fans of Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton was pushy and ambitious. He showed the pushiness when he dealt with Adams. Adams did not deal well with that. And this is just one of many famous quotes of Adams about Hamilton. And this one comes from after Adams's presidency, in his old age, when he's thinking back to his earlier days and sort of being nostalgic and swatting at Hamilton every couple of letters. And so here he says, I lose all patience when I think of a bastard brat of a Scotch peddler, which is probably the most famous thing that John Adams says about Hamilton. This creature was in a delirium of ambition. He had been blown up with vanity by the Tories, had fixed his eye on the highest station in America, and he hated every man, young or old, who stood in his way or could in any manner eclipse his laurels or rival his pretensions. Adams really didn't like him. And a delirium of ambition, when you're in this period and you have power, you're never supposed to look like you want power. That makes you a dangerous person. So you're not supposed to look ambitious. You're supposed to look as though, oh, yes, I'll take this position if you give it to me. But, presidents didn't campaign for office. They stayed at home and pretended that they didn't know what was happening. So part of what Adams is saying here is, this guy is crazy. He's so ambitious, he can't even hide it. He's just out there trying to get things for himself, which in this period, that was really kind of unheard of and made him a dangerous man.
But I think what's really interesting there is that point about how it's this nasty political era where at the same time you have to pretend you don't care about outcomes. Like that does seem a bit contradictory, right? And a little confusing. But I'm not the only one who has questions and confusion. I think we have some Q&As, and I think Zoya was going to bring us just a couple questions right away.
Bring them on.
So we've got some great questions so far. The first one is from Emily, who is a K through 12 educator. And she says, I usually share some of the Reynolds Affair with my students because it's history like this, stories that are not in textbooks, that catch their attention. I usually read excerpts from a book to share the story. Can you connect this event to any larger themes or events in our early history so they know I'm not just sharing it for shock value?
Well, in a way, it is a great example, although it is shocking and although the pamphlet is kind of distinctive in and of itself, it's a perfect example, kind of a version of what I just said. It's a perfect example of the real nasty spirit of politics in this period. You could, if you wanted to, I'm sure, if you had the time and desire, you could find all kinds of other nasty things that people are saying about each other or defending themselves from in this time period. You could find, as a matter of fact, you can look at the other pamphlet we're going to talk about today in a few minutes, and it has all kinds of weird insults and claims too. So the fact of the matter is, there are things about the Reynolds pamphlet that are distinctive, but it's very much representative of the general mood of politics in the period. So you're not just picking a crazy thing for your students, and I think you could pretty readily find other seemingly crazy things to join with it, even just that cartoon, to show the students that politics in this period was really dirty, rotten, and nasty because people thought the nation was on the line.
That makes sense. And you and Lisa have talked a little bit about how Hamilton was a pretty controversial figure. So we have a question from Michelle who asks, why did Washington appoint such a controversial treasurer? Did he really believe in his skills and talents and intelligence so much that it was worth it?
Good question. Well, there were a couple reasons why Washington picked Hamilton. One is he really knew him well. Hamilton had served at Washington's side throughout the Revolution, had been, a major primary aide of Washington's, had been giving word to what Washington wanted to happen. So Washington trusted him. Washington knew his intelligence and his talents. So that was part of it, a big part of it. It's important to realize that, in this period, like nowadays, you'd say, I want a Secretary of the Treasury. Let me find someone with great experience running a corporation or, with Treasury-ish experience to put in the post. In this period, they're just looking for people of character who seem to fit well with the job. Politician isn't a job yet in this period. So Washington, when he created his cabinet, had reasons to like Hamilton. He trusted him. Hamilton also, when he was even just in the army with Washington, already was expressing interest in the government, in questions of funding. So this was something that he was interested in anyway. So I think among many reasons, those are two reasons why it made perfect sense. Now, Washington knew that Hamilton could be problematic, and he was reminded of that again and again and again. I mean, actually, Hamilton leaves Washington's side at the Revolution because they have a fight, and Hamilton storms off. And that's, Washington knew who Hamilton was. But I think his talents and the fact that he believed that Hamilton, whether Washington agreed with him or not, was really thinking of the larger good, that made him a valuable person to have in the cabinet. And he wanted a cabinet of people not necessarily with all the same views, but who in one way or another seemed well adapted to the job that they were given.
Great, thank you. And so while we're on the topic of sort of this background of the pamphlet and the political climate of the time, obviously primary documents like this are such great resources. We have a question from Marlon, who's a K-12 educator. Are there any documents that historians wish Mrs. Alexander would not have destroyed so we could better understand these events?
Wow. Well, so this is an interesting thing because, and a lot of the founders themselves did this. When they were in their old age, and this is true definitely of Jefferson, Hamilton died suddenly, so he didn't get to do it, but his children did. They would begin to destroy things. Like Jefferson very carefully culled his letters so that what he left behind would be what he wanted people to see. He even edited some of his letters or commented on them. I didn't really mean this at the time. So very much they were thinking about what the future would bring and how people would see them. As I said, Hamilton died kind of quickly. He didn't get to do that, but his his sons, two of them particularly, spent a lot of time like deciding what to keep and what to get rid of. And as the person asking the question said, women, particularly of these politicians, didn't want to be public figures and destroyed a lot of things that, for the sake of privacy, they didn't want out in the world. I recently saw a letter that Elizabeth Hamilton didn't destroy that kind of touched me in a way. Hamilton, in his last couple weeks, was wanted to thank some of the people who had helped him get to the United States, and one of them was a woman in St. Croix who just had given him money and had helped him. And Hamilton says, and actually lists among the things he'd like done if he dies in the duel, he'd like her to be repaid in some way. He'd like to do something for her. So it's like a last wish. In case I die, I would really like to thank her. And what I found way later was a letter from Elizabeth Hamilton trying to track her down so she could contact her and fulfill Hamilton's wish, which I just found kind of touching. You know, it wasn't just something he sort of put out there and, you know, it's not easy to communicate or find people. This woman probably was somewhere in the Caribbean, and Elizabeth Hamilton tried to track her down so she could give her money on behalf of her husband. I found it touching that she tried to fulfill some of his last wishes. Not that I didn't expect her to, but this one in particular, I think, was kind of poignant.
Yeah, that sounds beautiful. I didn't know there was a letter like that. But thank you for those responses. With that, I will throw it back over to Lisa.
Well, one of the things you just said, so women didn't want to be public figures, which is very reminiscent of the famous Laura Thatcher Ulrich must used and decontextualized quotation of well-behaved women seldom make history.
Right.
We haven't talked about the pamphlet's contents yet. We've talked about its tone and how it meets that moment. But let's start talking a little bit about Maria Reynolds, who is the subject of so much of this pamphlet.
I know. Talk about someone who loses their privacy. So Maria Reynolds, here you see, you know, information about her. Born into a respectable family, marries James Reynolds. After this, so that what I'm about to describe happens in 1791. 1793, she decides she needs to divorce her husband, which I think in some ways will sound logical. And Aaron Burr actually helped her obtain that divorce, which I've always wanted to pursue and look at further. But at any rate, she's a respectable, not necessarily wealthy, but woman who it would be fine for elite people in this period to welcome in and include. There's nothing about her that was lowly. She was just, I like respectable. That's who she was. So what happens in 1791 is that she comes to visit Hamilton. And one evening, and I should say that at this point, Mrs. Hamilton and the children were not around. As the Hamilton musical says, right? He's tired. There's all of this bad stuff going on. She visits him and she essentially says she needs money to get back to her husband. And she has heard that Hamilton is a charitable person who helps people who have need. And so she's come to him to ask for help. And Hamilton says, well, I would be happy to help you. I don't have money sitting here in my office, but I can bring it to you this evening. And so he does indeed bring her the money. We're going to talk a little bit more about this when we get to the Reynolds pamphlet, but that's the beginning of an affair between the two of them. But it becomes complicated because Maria's husband, James, begins to demand blackmail payments to not tell people about this adulterous affair. Now, this is problematic on so many levels. James Hamilton doesn't say, "How dare you sleep with my wife?" He says, "You want to keep sleeping with her? Well, then pay me." And Hamilton, for a time, does. What happens is that some members of Congress get word that there's something weird happening, that there are slips of paper that say that Hamilton's giving money to somebody. It's unclear what that is. And so 3 members of Congress, James Monroe, Abraham Venable, and Frederick Muhlenberg, visit Hamilton. And they say, we see these papers. This looks fishy. And Hamilton says, oh, no, has nothing to do with government money. I'm paying blackmail because I'm having an adulterous affair with a woman. And these 3 congressmen are kind of embarrassed. And they say, oh, okay. Well, in that case, fine. We won't say anything about it. They promise to keep it private, a private matter. It'll stay just between the 4 of them. And so the matter ends.
I'm trying to get through in my head the difference between what is blackmail and what is something closer to prostitution. And I'm struggling with that a little bit.
Right.
But
right.
I'm ready to boo some people.
No, it's totally it's a really good question. That I'll let you sleep with her if you pay me money, or the other flip side, I won't tell anyone if you pay me money. So if you frame it that way, it feels less like prostitution. It's kind of the same thing, but I think that's the way it was framed. I won't tell anyone what you're doing if you pay me.
Yeah, I think we better go to the next slide. Well,
I think that's a good idea. Okay, so now we jump ahead in time. We jump ahead to 1797. This is years after the Reynolds Affair. And here we have yet another pamphlet with the long title that, doesn't make you want to jump into it, but it fills your footnotes a lot. If you're a historian and you're writing footnotes, it's always good to have these pamphlets because
I haven't even thought of that. My goodness.
So a lot of space. I shouldn't have given that secret away. Anyway, so this is a pamphlet, The History of the United States for 1796, including a variety of interesting particulars, blah, 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 which doesn't sound like what it's going to be. It's written by James Callender. Callender is a journalist who becomes famous for exposing scandals. As we will see, this is one of the scandals, Hamilton's actions, that he exposes. He's a Jeffersonian Republican, although he ultimately attacks Jefferson and helps to expose Sally Hemings's alleged affair with Jefferson. So Callender is that guy, right? He's a newspaper man who's in the middle of politics and isn't shy about stepping forward in this climate and saying, okay, I got something for you, and it looks bad. Let me lay it out for you. So he writes this pamphlet, which part of it is stuff that happened before that I think is bad, policy, things that the government did that in one way or another seem corrupt or bad to me. But then he says, there's another little matter that I think we need to discuss. And it has to do with Hamilton and a man named James Reynolds. Now, according to Callender, the Reynolds Affair shows that Hamilton is corrupt, that he was messing with treasury funds, and the little slips of paper that we know are blackmail payments are actually little sort of remnants of speculation, that there's something messy going on with Hamilton and government money. And the pamphlet, to prove this, talks about and includes content from, in some way or another, the 3 congressmen who promised not to ever say anything. He includes documents in it that show like the 3 congressmen saying and signing a statement that says, well, we went to visit Hamilton and he told us that this was an adulterous affair. So, okay, we promised not to say anything. We're not absolutely sure that that's the truth, but we'll stick with it. So basically, Callender lays out like primary materials, actual documents, letters and things from 1791 that seem to really prove that Hamilton was doing something messy, tricky, and corrupt, that James Reynolds was involved in it, and that this is proof of the corruption of the Federalists. And here you can see some of what he says. The charge of Reynolds wears a more serious aspect. If he was one agent for the purchase of certificates, so there he's talking about speculation, it may well be conceived, though it cannot yet be proved, that our secretary had 20 others. Physician, heal thyself. Before Mr. Hamilton prints any further defenses of other people, before he again arraigns one half of his fellow citizens as cutthroats, let him tell us what has become of Reynolds. Let him concern that this narrative is explicit, and that under all the circumstances of the affair, silence will be more fatal to his character than the most feeble vindication. So there's Callender saying, yeah, so this looks like one speculator. Definitely, there's got to be 20 more. And silence on Hamilton's part regarding this will be deadly.
Okay, the trouble is brewing. Okay, let's go to the next slide.
Well, and given what I said about Hamilton, this will not go well.
Yeah. Well, and I feel like there's a whole side joke about somebody named Callender, including an appendix of primary sources in his own work.
I feel like
there's something to be done there. But okay, but on to James Monroe.
Okay, so now what happens is Hamilton, logically enough, is infuriated. Someone leaked what happened. Venable and Monroe and Muhlenberg promised not to say anything about this, and there it is in some weird form in this pamphlet. So Hamilton does the logical thing. He goes to all three men individually and says, did you leak this? And Venable and Muhlenberg say, nope, I did not. Monroe's a little cagier. And before I get to what happens there, this is actually a letter talking about a meeting that Monroe has to have with Hamilton. It says, Mr. Monroe has the honor to inform Colonel Hamilton of his arrival in Philadelphia, and also that Mr. Muhlenberg and himself propose having a meeting in the morning, after which Colonel Hamilton shall immediately hear from them on the subject in which he is concerned, which is this whole Reynolds mess. So Hamilton meets with Monroe, as this helps to accomplish. Monroe says, I basically didn't have anything to do with it. He doesn't absolutely say no. And Hamilton responds by saying, quote, that as your representation is false. Now that sounds vague, but what Hamilton is saying is that Monroe is a liar. That's serious talk in the age of dueling. You never call a gentleman a liar or a coward. If you do, you're almost inviting a duel. So Hamilton says that is your representation. I think is totally false, is what he says. Monroe responds by saying, you are a scoundrel. That's another dueling word. And then the two of them apparently stand up, and one and the other are saying things like, I am ready, get your pistols. They're ready to walk outside and fight a duel. And they each have a friend there because it was clear that this might become a duel, and the friends pull them apart and sit them down and try to make things nice. But there was a near duel between James Monroe and Alexander Hamilton, and it didn't end with that conversation. They exchanged letters. They each sort of thought, well, I'm showing him, like, I'm willing to fight, but he's not willing to fight. But again, it shows a little bit about the politics of the period, but also how seriously Hamilton was taking this charge.
That is serious. I mean, going all the way to a duel. Okay, so I'm sure that at that point, Hamilton cooled down and didn't do anything foolish for the rest of what he was going to do, or maybe he released the Reynolds pamphlet. So I think we have some quotations from the Reynolds pamphlet that go directly to Maria Reynolds. We have a bit of a question going on about that, in which he is explaining one wrong in order to explain that he couldn't have done another wrong. Is that a good way to kind of explain it?
Basically, but what he's doing with the pamphlet, so he is indeed saying with the pamphlet, you're accusing me of doing X. I didn't do X, and everything you have there, all the evidence, is because I did Y. So I didn't mess with treasury funds or government funds. I would never do that. I'm an honest public servant. I committed adultery. So all the evidence you have has to do with adultery. Now, to make that persuasive, clearly Hamilton felt that he had to put a lot of details in this pamphlet to make it really clear that what he's claiming really happened. He can't just, or at least by his logic, couldn't just make vague charges.
And by the last time I checked, it was 58 pages of documenting that he had had it.
Yes, well, like every Hamilton scholar, I've actually got a copy of the pamphlet here, and here you can kind of get a sense of, it's not short.
It's not a press release.
It is not a press release. So, the logic is, you think I mess with treasury funds. I was speculating. I never would do that. I'm an honest public servant. But in private life, he committed adultery. And in his mind, he will then remain a trusted public servant, and his reputation on that level won't be damaged. He's just an adulterer, and he thought clearly that was a lesser charge. But the fact that he had to really, really, really prove that he had committed adultery explains in part why there's so much detail in the pamphlet. He always wrote more than he should. In this case, there's a reason for it. He wants people to read this and think there's absolutely no doubt that he was committing adultery, that this wasn't corruption and speculation. So he does things in the pamphlet like this. He suggests that Maria Reynolds is like luring him in. The variety of shapes which this woman could assume was endless. She could portray herself in different ways. And sort of the underlying theme there is, and I was helpless against her charms. So again, he's trying to make this feel, according to his standards, like something that really happened.
And again, 58 pages. So I think we have another really long and particularly interesting quote that I think you might want to read a little bit from this to kind of fill us in the details. This is still PG. We should add, still PG.
It is PG. It's my favorite paragraph in the pamphlet because it shows you how far he felt that he needed to go to make his point. And it's just not what you expect to find in a political pamphlet by a founder. So I mentioned before, he said, I don't have the money here, but I will give it to you this evening. Here you see he picks up that story. He says, I replied that her situation was a very interesting one, that I was disposed to afford her assistance to convey her to her friends, but this at the moment not being convenient to me, which was the fact, in case you think it isn't, I must request the place of her residence to which I should bring or send a small supply of money. She told me the street and the number of her house where she lodged. In the evening, I put a bank bill in my pocket and went to the house. I inquired for Mrs. Reynolds and was shown upstairs, at the head of which she met me and conducted me into a bedroom. I took the bill out of my pocket and gave it to her. And this is the line that, incredible. Some conversation ensued from which it was quickly apparent that other than pecuniary consolation would be acceptable. That's a dainty way of saying, she was interested in me. And so I took advantage of that. Yay me. So again, that's an incredible level of detail. She gave me the address. I went to the house. I was shown to the top of the stairs. He's trying really hard to prove that this is exactly what happened. That's also, just think about what I just read and imagine out in the world, this pamphlet circulating with that kind of a paragraph floating around in the middle of it. It's pretty amazing.
Okay, so he defended his honor by declaring and documenting for 58 pages how exactly he cheated on his wife. So resting on that for a second, did anybody buy this kind of defense? Like, was it accepted? What was the fallout from all of this?
Well, so
and I think we can change slides to get to the first part.
Well, wait, before we do, okay.
Oh, sorry.
It's okay. So generally speaking, this didn't seemingly hurt his career. I mean, it definitely got attention. A lot of people talked about it. He wasn't seen anymore as being necessarily a discreet man. It didn't generally help his reputation, although again, it didn't enormously harm him among men. And there's a reason why Hamilton said, yeah, I'll just publicly confess to adultery, because it's not as though that was a sin that others weren't committing, right? So in his mind, he probably thought, well, men do this all the time. And it may not be great, but okay, I'll confess to it. So it generally doesn't damage his career, and men, particularly ones who don't like him, slam at him for it and call him, corrupt, not only corrupt, but, an adulterer. He's a man of sin. He has no virtue, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So he opens up a new avenue for people to insult him. But what's interesting is some of the response to the pamphlet among women. So this is a really interesting clipping from the Philadelphia Aurora General Advertiser from the time of the pamphlet. And it's an extract of a letter. If you read newspapers from this period very often, rather than here's a story, you will see like a gentleman from so-and-so sends me this letter, and the letter would be put in the newspaper. So this is an example of that sort of thing that says, I send you a pamphlet worth perusing. It is Colonel Hamilton's, and such a one as it would seem he would not have written had he not previously taken leave of his senses. And then it goes on to explain some of the detail. But what's interesting about it is towards the bottom, he says, Hamilton's book came out here this morning, and it's from New York. And now at 6 o'clock in the evening, the whole town rings with it. The women cry out against him, as if its publication was high treason against the rights of women. In publishing it at all, Hamilton is considered as indiscreet. Now, I mentioned before, he's a man who's not discreet. But what's interesting about this is the idea that some women think that it is treason against the rights of women. And when I thought about that in preparing for what we're doing here, I thought, which woman are they talking about, right? Are they talking about the rights of Elizabeth Hamilton and this exposure of her and Hamilton doing this to her? Or are they talking about the right of Maria Reynolds to privacy, that this is hauling her into public view? It's a little interesting to consider what rights of women are being claimed. There are many we could think of, treason against the rights of women, but you want more specific language. So women, according to this, and we'll get another example shortly, are definitely objecting to this. Something's not right about it, and it shouldn't be treating women this way.
Hard to argue against that.
It is. I mean, speaking as a historian, when you work on something like this or write about something like this, some part of you, and I've been working on Hamilton for decades, some part of me is still fundamentally thinks, what? Like, really? You thought this was smart? You thought this was a good idea, and you did this for reasons you thought were logical. How? I understand his logic, but it's impossible to fully accept the fact that he did it with this much detail for good reason, but again, way over the top.
Well, we have, I think on the next slide, one person in particular who is taking umbrage.
Indeed. This gets us back to the Adamses, both of whom really don't like Hamilton. And this quote comes from a longer statement. I'll read the longer bit that this comes from, in which Abigail is swiping at Hamilton. She likes to swipe at Hamilton, in part responding or saying what she thinks is a result of the Reynolds pamphlet. She says, and this is to John, I have not any confidence in the honor, integrity, or patriotism of any man who does not believe that thou shalt not commit adultery is a positive prohibition of God. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife is another. And yet I have been credibly informed that the audacious publication of that man has only rendered him more bold and hardened in iniquity. Right? I think it's pretty clear she's saying that adultery is bad, but he's not sorry at all, right? What kind of a person doesn't follow the 10 Commandments, Abigail is saying, and doesn't even feel sorry for what he did? So again, another person, and in this case, a woman, but I'm sure there were some men who said it as well. What kind of a person does this make him?
Well, and Abigail Adams is hardly some humorless, constantly judgy. I mean, she's a very interesting person, very lively mind, right? And so to get that criticism from, she's just having none of it. Like, that was clearly the last straw.
Well, she's wonderfully blunt. Mm-hmm. She has strong ideas, political and otherwise. She's involved in politics. I mean, she is sometimes advising her husband. At the time, I remember at least once I found someone saying that she was a better politician than her husband. So she's someone who's in the mix of things, and yet isn't officially a part of them. But it's not a surprise to me that she would step forward and say, and here's what I think, and say it with such force and speak that way in this letter to John. Their correspondence, I'll just say, even though we're not talking about it, is really incredible, because they write to each other as friends. They even refer to each other as my dearest friend. And she holds nothing back in talking about what she thinks about national politics, what's going on a national level. If you haven't looked at that correspondence, I highly encourage you to do it. You get a real depiction of a couple, of a love affair, that you don't often see preserved, certainly not in early America.
Well, and speaking of John Adams,
indeed,
have further information.
Oh, right. So here's, and the reason this is here is because I wanted to make the point that you would think that Hamilton, after the Reynolds pamphlet, would say to himself, wow, that was a bombshell. Maybe I shouldn't do something like that again, a crazy pamphlet like that. I should learn a lesson. You might think someone would suggest that. If you know Hamilton, you would know that there's absolutely no way that would happen. And this represents unwise pamphlet number 2, which Hamilton writes in 1800, in which he attacks the candidate of his own party for president, John Adams. It's a letter concerning the public conduct and character of John Adams. Again, a lengthy discussion of why Adams is unfit to be president. Now, Hamilton thinks, well, there's another person I'd rather have as president who's actually a kind of a vice presidential candidate, although there wasn't an official difference between presidential and vice presidential candidates. Typically, the person who wins the most votes is president, and the person who wins the second most votes is vice president. So what Hamilton is trying to do with this is get enough people to back away from Adams that his preferred candidate will become president and Adams won't. Adams is not manageable. They don't get along clearly, so having him be president will not please Hamilton. But that may sound logical to Hamilton. It's a pretty big risk, and it doesn't necessarily work that way. And what I found at one point, so his friends, he writes to his friends and he says, I'm going to do this. What do you think? His friends write to each other, and they essentially say to each other, I'm not going to tell him. Like, are you going to tell him? I'm not going to tell him. And one of them says, if I tell him how bad an idea this is, he will never speak to me again. Right? I cannot step forward and say this. And ultimately, one of them decides to take the plunge, steps forward and says, Hamilton, this is a really bad idea. Hamilton publishes it anyway, and even worse, it comes out, it makes a splash, and Hamilton writes to a friend and says, I think I need part 2. And the friend is like, I'm not helping you with that at all. And he doesn't publish part 2. But this is his nature, right? He's a man who's good with words, that raises him to power and gets him in trouble. Ultimately, the duel that kills him is because of things he said about Aaron Burr. And he just doesn't know when to stop. I have a very modest collection of pamphlets, and this copy of the Reynolds pamphlet is one, and I call it the Stupid Things Hamilton Did collection. And it includes a copy of the Reynolds pamphlet, it includes a copy of the Adams pamphlet, and it includes some of the material that leads up to the duel, all of which are things that, Hamilton in one way or another was shooting off his mouth or his pen and getting himself in trouble. So he does not learn a lesson.
No lesson.
No lesson at all.
Well, and it seems like the people around him wind up having to deal with it until, the shooting.
Well, until that unfortunate shooting. But, again, we're talking about the first 10 years of the government. We're talking about people worried about how the nation is going to fare. we're talking about not, you don't have like solid organized things like modern political parties. And you have all of this going on that, it's certainly not helping people come together to get things done. In the case of the Federalists, the pamphlet doesn't divide them, but it sure helps. They were already kind of divided. So the Federalist Party is kind of split over this too. So it doesn't do a lot of good, basically. It doesn't do a lot of good.
Well, then let's do one last slide and talk a little bit about how this works for Elizabeth Hamilton. And this is her at 94, right? So she definitely outlives him.
She lives forever. She was invited to be at the laying of the cornerstone for the Washington Monument in Washington. She honestly lives forever, and she becomes like almost a tourist attraction. Her last year she lived in Washington, and people wanted to see Mrs. Hamilton. She would be at parties or something, and people would want to see her or would note in letters to their friends, I saw Mrs. Hamilton. So she was a really strong woman, which I think you really had to be if you were going to be married to Alexander Hamilton. But, she really was a woman of substance and power. And in her old age, we know that she wasn't around. Well, we know that she wasn't around when the Reynolds Affair happened. We know that when the pamphlet comes out and Hamilton writes the Reynolds Pamphlet, she goes to Albany to stay with her parents, with the kids. So that's her comment on what's happening. And Hamilton writes these sort of vaguely appeasing letters like, hi, dear, how's it going? Because he clearly, how could he not know what he did? But we don't know. We have no evidence from that time period, really, about what Elizabeth was thinking, other than the fact that she left town. Go ahead in time, way ahead in time. As you said, she's 94. She's living in Washington, extreme old age. She's one of the few people left of the sort of founding period, of a founder sort of person. And another person who's still around is James Monroe. So James Monroe decides to pay a call, ex-President James Monroe, to pay a call on Elizabeth Hamilton at her home, which he does. And he says something along the lines of, Mrs. Hamilton, you and I are among the only left from our time. And I thought it would be a wonderful thing for me to come and pay tribute to you and for the two of us to have this moment. And Elizabeth Hamilton says, and this is a bad paraphrase, if you think that because we're this much closer to the grave that I have forgiven you for what you did, you are gravely mistaken. And she storms out of the room, turns her back on former President James Monroe. Now, I really, really hope that happened. It comes from a source that suggests maybe it really did, and it's very true to her character. So if it's true, it's a little glimpse at her real feelings about that affair and the repercussions of it. At the beginning, the question towards the beginning of someone, things that maybe women would have saved that might tell us something. There's a reason why we don't know what she thought about the Reynolds Affair. We get this story from somebody else.
Well, with that wrap up, I think we have time for a question at least, and some announcements at the end, including announcements about our programs related to the Hamilton musical.
Yes, we have so many great questions. We won't have time to get all of them, but while we're on the topic of Eliza, we have a question from Elle, who is a high school student. And she says, I was wondering if this was truly the first time Elizabeth Hamilton found out about this affair. The Hamilton music sort of makes it seem so. And if so, why didn't he tell her first?
Ooh, good question. Well, it doesn't necessarily. Well, it's a good question. But we don't know if it's the absolute first time that she knows of the affair. What we know is that now the entire world knows. She wasn't around in 1791 when this was happening. So it's not as though, Hamilton had to sneak around. But for all we know, it is possible that he talked to her about it and it sort of passed. We don't know, right? There's so much that we don't know, in part because wives of public men destroyed so much of their correspondence. So it might not have been the first time she found out about the affair. It might have been really the fact that Hamilton just publicized it and sent it out to the world in a pamphlet. That is what drove her to go visit her parents, right? What? She has lots of reasons to be outraged at the pamphlet. And maybe she was learning about the affair for the first time, but even if she wasn't, the pamphlet itself, I mean, what an outrage if you're Elizabeth Hamilton.
Yeah, that's a great point. We don't know if it was just her reaction to the publicity of it all. So we've mentioned Hamilton the musical a few times tonight. And so as great as the musical is, it's a work of fiction. And we have a question about fiction in general, referring to the book My Dear Hamilton by Stephanie Dre and Laura Camoy. Michelle asks, in a larger sense, do you think history education is well served or not by accessible, well-researched fictionalizations that condense and telegraph history and express how it felt more than actually what happened?
Okay, that's a great question. I mean, first I will say regarding the Hamilton musical, that there are some historians who are grouchy about the Hamilton musical because it's not precise, it doesn't include important things in it. As an educator, what I know is that it made people so inherently interested in this time period that I can respond by saying, yeah, okay, you're interested in it. That's great. But let me tell you what really happened. It's more interesting even. Come on with me and learn about the time period. So it's like a doorway into wanting to learn about this time period. And I think historical fiction can serve the same purpose as long as it's taught making it clear that it's fiction, that it's again, the question suggests how people might have felt versus what actually happened. You would have to say that this is, what people might have felt. I suppose one way to teach fiction would be to ask students other ways that people might have felt. I, at one point in my American Revolution lecture course, used Gore Vidal's novel Burr at the end of the semester to kind of help sum up the semester. But I used it after a whole semester as a way to say, okay, we learned all of this stuff. What does this piece of fiction tell you about what we learned, about what really happened, about what didn't happen? So we knew it was fiction. So I think historical fiction can be a great thing to teach with, but I think you have to really be strategic, because I think in an age of fake news and questionable facts, and history in some ways being the teaching of history under attack, I think you always want students to have a sense of what's real and what isn't. And I think, I'm sure all the educators out there watching this already know that. But that would be why I would want to be strategic about using fiction to teach.
Great, thank you. As somebody who's an English minor and a history major, that I really appreciate that answer. I love historical fiction, but it's good to keep it grounded. Okay, so before we wrap up tonight's presentation, I'm going to run you through some of our upcoming programs. So our next Inside the Vault will be on November 2nd at 7 p.m. Allison and Sandy will be back, and we will be joined by Holly Mayer, who will discuss materials related to Margaret Corbin. Our next book breaks is October 8th at 2 p.m. this Sunday, where Drew Kilpin-Foss will discuss her book, Necessary Trouble Growing Up at Mid-Century. And the very last thing we want to plug tonight is EduHam. So EduHam Online helps students in middle and high school see the relevance of the founding era by using primary sources to create a performance piece following the model that Lin-Manuel Miranda used to create Hamilton. Participating students can submit their piece for the chance to win a trip to New York to see Hamilton on Broadway. There are two ways to do this. Teachers can submit an unlimited number of students through the lottery, or teachers can submit up to 5 of their students' best pieces in the competition. If you would like to learn more, please visit hamilton.gilderlehrman.org to register. Well, thank you everyone so much for joining us tonight. I want to give another thank you to Dr. Freeman and Dr. Anderson for tonight's conversation. This was really great, and I hope everyone enjoyed tonight's presentation.
Thanks for having me.